Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
Hello, Ryan. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I mean, we spent 5 days together, so I think you know.
We're also sitting about 6 inches from one another because we're recording on not only together in person in Louisville, but we are on the exact same microphone.
Yes, you always say this every time we record in person, but you and I don't know how to set up 2 microphones to record.
And we have no money to pay an audio engineer, and we're afraid. We know this works, and so it's okay. And you know, we don't get to be near each other. I think we're near each other, what, 1 episode a year? And this is that episode. It's very special.
Yeah, and we just came back from a long hike, so I had to go shower before.
We're both freshly showered. Yeah. I feel very good about this proximity.
Yeah, it's not bad.
But as anyone who knows you well knows, you got to watch those hands when you're this close.
Well, it's good to see you, Kiernan. Have you enjoyed your time here in Kentucky?
I've been having a great time here in Old Kentuck, as I like to call it. And this is the first episode of, I think, 2 planned episodes that we're going to do. And while we're currently sitting in Louisville, we've been corrected often. People know we're tourists.
Louisville.
But today, I could not be happier because we're going to be talking about a national park, Mammoth Cave National Park.
Yeah, we drove down to Mammoth Cave National Park, which is conveniently located in Cave City. It's been really great. So I'm excited. I mean, we have a lot to talk about today. But Kiernan, we did get a bunch of reviews from our listeners that we have to kind of jump in and highlight because we are big fans of reviews, and we love these 5-star reviews.
Absolutely, and you don't want to skip over what is most important is the Judy alert, where I just want to say while we pull up those reviews, Judy, I'm looking at your son. He's okay. He's not in put himself in a dangerous situation. He's right here in Kentucky. You couldn't be safer. Well, you are pretty liberal for Kentucky, but.
Yeah. Well, again, Louisville is a pretty progressive town.
A bastion of the left.
Yeah. So a couple folks to give shout outs on the old iTunes. Want to thank Ken Face. That's his name, Ken Face.
Ken Face.
Yeah. Who said that with a perfect fix for his for his always dreaming of travel brain, and that he loves the substance of the podcast. Banter, substance, extras.
I think he said structure of the podcast.
Oh, and the substance. Yeah, and the substance, I think.
Yeah, he said substance more than once the way he recounted it. It's a paraphrase.
But a few times ago, somebody said that we had too much witty banter up top, and now we're getting compliments.
I don't know that those people said witty. I think they just said they talk a lot at the top.
I want to thank Bad Chad 1. Who gave us 5 stars, and a couple Louisville recs that we're going to get to in the next episode, because we definitely heard you, Chad, and we took your main advice, so we'll talk about that. And then T. Lacey 17, thank you for this is where the witty banner comes in. She says she loves the witty banner and the extensive episodes on Latin America and national parks.
That's nice. That's like a shout out for each of us in this review.
Yeah. They want to know if we have any more places in Spain or Europe. It's their first time in Europe. That's super exciting.
We've got a very old episode. The audio is very bad. Be forewarned, the audio is very bad, but it's the authors of a book called Room with a Pew, and it's about monasteries and convents you can stay in while you travel all over Spain.
Yeah. Now, this person's in university studying. They're probably not going to want to stay at a convent. But one thing I will say is check out San Sebastian in Spain. It's a super cool town, small city. You can take the train there, a little bit off the beaten path of Madrid and Barcelona. So that's my rec for you. And I would love to do more episodes on Spain. We do have an episode on Barcelona that you can find in the archives.
That is Gaudi's Barcelona is the name of that episode.
Exactly. I'll throw a link there in the show notes. And then the last review, and this is from Cuia? Is that how you would say that?
It's an interesting spelling, and I think that's a good guess.
Yeah, and this has become sort of a contentious review because this person asks, basically, this woman asked if does Ryan like Kiernan?
Yep, that's the name of the top of the review. Yeah. It's less a review than a deep existential question in our relationship. Does Ryan like Kiernan?
So we threw the question up on Instagram. It's there at OOO Podcast. And we asked folks, does Ryan like Kiernan? And a slim majority said yes.
It was slim.
Very slim.
Slim.
But quite a few people said I was ambivalent. And yeah, I do like Kiernan. 97% of the time.
I mean, Kiernan's tough to take. I would say 97% of the time is more than I like Kiernan most of the time.
And then they did ask one other thing. And that is, they really like our best of episodes. We have best bookstores to visit, cool jails to visit. And they've asked for more of those, including things like best art cities, best college towns, etc. We love that idea. It's actually sort of easier to do those episodes. So
you don't have to say that on air here.
But so we will definitely think about a few episodes in those best of categories to do. And then Kiernan, she asked if we could do an episode about women travelers. And I think, tips for women. I think we should have a guest on. So we should do some research there.
That's right. She was struck. We did a Morocco episode, and this listener went to Morocco and did say that as a single female traveler, she felt very like she had to be on guard. There was a lot of catcalling. And I do remember noting that while I didn't travel there as a woman, I was there with Catherine, my wife. And that is something that we could dig into in future, especially, I mean, obviously you and I would need a guest to really come on and talk about that well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that's something we can speak to so directly, but it would be great to have a guest on. And then we had a lovely email from Kendra. Shout out to Kendra. She shared a lot of her thoughts about how much she enjoys the show, and says that we're the perfect distraction during work week commutes and runs. Kiernan, do you listen to us when you run?
No, I never listen to us. I go out of my way not to listen to us. I just can't take. I just find myself over and over in my head saying, "Does Ryan like Kiernan?"
Well, she is working on training for a marathon, so she's been doing a lot of running, and she wants long episodes. So I think she's going to be in luck because we have a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, buckle in. I think for the next 4 hours, we're going to really dig into the history, the geology, and tips and tricks of visiting Mammoth Cave National Park.
And with that, Kiernan, I think it's time to take off.
Tell the cabin crew.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
All right, Ryan. Well, this is the first time that you've seen me in a national park, so you're now aware. It's like a kid in a candy store when I get right beyond that brown sign, that national park brown wooden sign that you are entering a special nature preserve. You only get here in the good old USA.
Yeah, I have never seen someone have to be physically restrained from talking to a park ranger before. That was my first time.
We're going to dig into the rangers. I've got some thoughts on the rangers who we took tours from. So just to give a little structure to the episode, I'm going to say right up front, folks should know that I'm a big fan of visiting caves. I'm not like an active spelunker, but I love when I can take a tour of a good cave, and Mammoth Cave has been on my mind for a very long time. So if you want to get sort of acclimated to what it's like and what you should be looking for when you're visiting a cave, I'm going to recommend an episode back in the archives called Caves 101. We'll link to that in the show notes. And for this episode, we're going to give a bit of an overview of Mammoth Cave National Park and what makes it special. Then we're going to talk about some of the history that we learned while we're there. Like a lot of national parks, there's a few personalities that really come to life when you're in the space, all about the founding and exploration of the park, and some very, very rich storytelling that we experienced in Mammoth Cave. And then finally, and this is most important if you're heading to Mammoth Cave anytime soon, we're going to give practical tips and tricks about how you should structure your time. And I would say this is a particularly difficult national park to kind of figure out because there are so many different types of tours you can do to visit different parts of the cave. So we did the research. We've now been on the ground, and I think we have a good game plan if you're planning a visit.
We've been underground, Kiernan, not on the ground.
Okay, well, with that joke kicking us off, so let's start in on a bit of the overview of the park. So to begin with, I had not appreciated how much Mammoth Cave put Kentucky on the map. Over and over again, the rangers were pointing out that this has been a major tourist attraction for this state, going well back to the early 1800s when the cave was just starting to be explored by people moving out to the frontier. And so it really is sort of a piece of it's a place that the locals take great pride in.
Absolutely. And it's been fun talking to, folks here at the restaurants and in the ride shares about Mammoth Cave. And people have been very excited that we have been going and coming back from there.
And so the distinguishing characteristic everyone should know is that Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system in the world. That's the longest in the world. Sometimes I'm just like so amazed by what riches the America's blessed with. We got the Grand Canyon, we got Glacier National Park, and we have the longest cave system in the world. It really warms the cockles of my heart, makes that patriotism come up inside me.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to believe that we are lucky enough here in Kentucky to have the longest cave system in the world, and a cave system that's so big that it is currently still being mapped. So still discovering parts of the cave.
That's right. So there are 400 or so miles. It seems to range from about 420 to 430 based on who you ask at the park that are mapped. And the reason that it's in flux is, as you say, there's active scientists and explorers who are still exploring, and they think that the full cave system is likely to cap at 1,000 miles or more. So they might not even have found half the cave starting to explore from the 1800s on. It's just incredible to think about.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And we're going to talk a bit today about some of the folks who have contributed to that exploring from the very beginning up until today. And it's a cool group of people.
So to give you a sense of how this cave system came to be, the panels in the visitor center describe it. Think of like a plate full of spaghetti, right? A bunch of strands that are piled on top of each other. And that's because this cave system has so many tunnels that criss and cross and really are leveled at, they say, at about 5 levels stacked up on each other. But honestly, I think that could be expanded in the future because, as they say, they're starting to use like submersible drones to go down under the water level to see how far these passageways actually go.
Yeah, and there are opportunities in the cave to sort of look up and look down and get a sense of all those layers. And you and I kept going back to the spaghetti metaphor that is mentioned in the visitor center.
And so the caves themselves were limestone, which when you have water coming through limestone, it can wear it away and wash it away. And so that's what actually formed these great passageways below the ground over millennia. And what's very interesting and distinct about this cave system is that there's a slate and sandstone slab that sits above that limestone below. And sure enough, like in a big part of the cave, you can look up and it almost is like a level roof has been put on. And that's that protective sandstone and slate cap. And what that does is it actually prevents a lot of the rainwater and the groundwater from seeping down into the caves below. So it's mostly a dry cave. Yeah,
it's pretty remarkable how flat the ceiling of the cave is in multiple parts. I mean, it does look like somebody was up there just, somebody had constructed it. It's so perfectly flat and smooth.
There's a real misconception about Mammoth Cave, though. When we were discussing meeting and going here together, time and again I read, well, there's not going to be the stalactites and stalagmites and amazing features that you most associate with a cave. They're known for their big chambers, thus Mammoth National Park. But I will say that I found that to be a misconception. So let me just give you a little taste of it. There's a New York Times article in 2008 about Mammoth Cave, and this is what they said. But they also lack many of the fancy calcite features like stalactites and stalagmites that form when water seeps down through limestone for millions of years. And that is, when you picture a cave, what you picture. But what I would argue back is what's amazing about Mammoth Cave is you actually do get some of those features just in particular pockets of the park, but you do get to visit those extraordinary sites, see a lot of those cave formations, and you just get incredible variety across all of the different caves that you can visit. So there's huge caverns that are like basketball stadiums, and then there are tight squeezes and slot canyons with big steep sides. There's mountains that you climb over within and tight little holes you have to get through. So every 10, 20 minutes that you go through, it's kind of a new cave experience.
Yeah, and we spent about 8 hours underground and saw, between 1 and 1.5% of the total, length of the cave. So it really varies what you can see, and that's one of the cool things about it.
And one of the rangers said something that I had never thought about before when visiting caves, but it's an interesting thing because I actually, now that I reflect on the ones I visited in the past, it's true. He said, there's often a dichotomy between big caves and decorated caves. So huge spaces underground and spaces that are full of those beautiful cave features. And he said that's because, over time, a decorated cave is going to accumulate more and more on the ceiling and on the floor. And so it over time becomes quite small. And what's very distinctive about Mammoth Cave is that it has both of these things in a single cave system.
Yeah, and it's mammoth. I mean, it's incredibly there are rooms that you will see if you visit that are incredibly tall and grand, and then there are spaces that are much smaller for sure.
And Ryan, you may remember too that they make a lot of the fact that there's this one particular mineral that you can find in Mammoth Cave, and it's called gypsum.
Well, I don't think you should say gypsum. That's a word I don't. It doesn't sound like you should be able to say that.
All right, we're not. I understand what you're doing there, but I'm not gonna respond to that pun, that indirect pun. But for the mineral gypsum, Ryan, now do you happen to know what gypsum is used for in like an industrial sense?
Drywall.
Ryan was there doing an impression of a local who was on our tour who knew right away that gypsum was in drywall.
But I knew the rest of the time, every other tour we went on, I knew I became that guy.
That is one of the advantages of going on several different tours, is that you always have the right answers when the tour guide asks a question. And gypsum presents as this beautiful, glimmering, beautiful white on the cave ceiling and on the walls. And we particularly had some very good tour guide storytellers who said, you have to imagine the first people that were coming in here, 200 years ago, there would have been these gypsum, he described them as gypsum flowers that were blooming from every surface, the ceiling, the walls, and the floor below. They were stepping on them as they were coming in. And it's this incredibly fragile, slow growing, but very intricate sort of formation. And there's still a fair number that are left in the caves. Kind of a miracle that after 200 years of tourism, they continue to be there for us, but far, far less than there originally used to be.
Yeah, folks had some sticky fingers in the 1800s, early 1900s.
That's right. And so while they used to be that when you were originally going in for tours from 1810 to the late 1800s, it would be acceptable for you to take a gypsum flower off the wall. The sad truth is, though, that they're so fragile that they likely would have fallen apart before they got home to be a souvenir for the visitor. The gypsum also not only presents in these really interesting geometric flowers, but in different parts of the cave, it's grown in different shapes. And so there's one area where they call them snowballs, where they look like snowballs. And then my favorite one was there's a place that they called Mary's Vineyard, and the gypsum had appeared almost looking like bunches of grapes all along the wall. And that's why they call that area Mary's Vineyard.
And one of the things that the guides will do is they will point out and they will make sure that you see these gypsum formations with their flashlights. And so there's a lot to see, but don't worry, the guides are going to kind of point you to the exact places to look to see some of the best examples of this.
One of the other striking things, we were talking about that early tourism that happens, and we're going to talk about some of the personalities of the guides from that time. But one of the major attractions of going into Mammoth Cave was that they would let you write your name and other messages, even drawings up on the ceiling of parts of the cave. And so this level of gypsum, or that flat slate and sandstone ceiling, actually turned into kind of quite a nice canvas for people to graffiti for decades and decades and decades. And when I had read about this before we visited the park, I thought it was just going to be like, a name here and there. But there are chambers in the cave that are just name upon name, hundreds of names. And what they would do is, because they would be exploring without electricity, of course, they were going in with lanterns or candles, and the guides would charge 5 cents, give you a candle, and put it on a long stick that you would then raise up to the ceiling, and you would use the smoke from the candle to put a dot and another dot and another dot and another dot to help form letters and messages and drawings up on the ceiling. And incredibly, because it's such a dry cave system, these persisted today. I mean, it's really quite eerie to have all that lettering just kind of floating above you. It's like a weird Sesame Street film.
Yeah, I mean, some of it looks like sort of a wall in Brooklyn by the time they're done with it.
Yeah, and my favorite detail was that because it could be hard to look up and have your arm extended for all that time, the guides started putting mirrors on the floor for the tourists to write their name. And so they would finish, it must have taken an hour or two, and they would write it in the mirror, and then you'd look up and they wrote their names backwards. And you see that all over the place. It's so weird. It's like the guides didn't forewarn them. Make sure you don't do it backwards because you're looking in a mirror.
Yeah, I mean, that is really something funny to think about. I mean, currently the cave is lit in sort of a movie theater atmosphere, they say. So there's definitely some low lighting. But back then they would have been doing all that with basically just the lantern and the light they were using to write their name.
And today the park tries to give you just a little taste of that, where you can actually take lantern tours. Now they're battery powered lanterns, of course, but they they try to show you what it would be like to explore with just pitch blackness except for your lantern. And sure enough, there are these legends and anecdotes they tell about people whose candles went out and were visited by spirits they thought were in the cave. And, it does get pretty eerie in there at certain points. And before we dive even further into the history, the one other type of formation that you get that is really, really special at Mammoth Caves is what they call flowstone. And so flowstone are basically these sheets of calcium carbonate that form in all these different formations and clearly being pulled by gravity. It's almost like stalactites that are layered upon one another so that it almost looks like water coming down a long wall. And so there's one particular place in Mammoth Cave, which we'll talk about which tours you can see it on, that's called Frozen Niagara. And I will say, again, I just didn't like this association that Mammoth didn't have all these special things, because Frozen Niagara was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen in a cave.
Yeah, that was the culmination of 8 hours of our cave touring, and it's definitely really special. And I can't wait to share photos of that with folks on the old Instagram.
So you do get to learn about all this great geology while you're down there, but what's so wonderful about the national park system is they also preserve so much of the history and teach you about how the park came to be, what makes it special. And you're especially lucky if you get a tour guide who clearly just kind of nerds out on this stuff, him or herself. People who really immerse themselves in the diaries of people that visited 200 years before. And I think we got really lucky on that front.
Yeah, it's clear that the tour guides there are just so dedicated to Mammoth Cave and the history and the legacy, and they share a lot of really fascinating stuff.
And I noticed at Mammoth, they really went out of their way to leave some of the artifacts in place in the cave so that they were prompted to tell you certain stories. Now, one thing that you can't see in the cave today, but you can see represented in the visitor center, is that there's actually a much longer history of Native Americans visiting the cave. And the truth is, they don't totally know why. They don't know whether this was a living area or whether they were going down to find certain minerals minerals to bring back up to the surface. And, they have found some weapons, some sandals, some pottery, basic things like that. And even they have found mummified remains that were mummified naturally in the cave. And for a time in the past, they even used to present those mummified bodies, but they have since been buried unmarked in different areas of the cave, so as not to be disrespectful to the memory of the Native Americans who used the space.
But one of the things to note is that the cave system is so large that even the Native Americans who were there thousands of years ago only saw a small percentage of the cave, and it wasn't until later on when folks like Stephen Bishop, who we're going to talk about, really went deep into this cave and started to understand just how grand it was.
Mammoth also became more than just a tourist spot during the War of 1812, because another mineral that it was rich in, I guess the dirt floors that filled a lot of the passageways, was something called saltpeter. And Ryan, I only knew what saltpeter was because of the musical. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
Oh, 1776, saltpeter, madam.
You bring up 1776 on this pod so often.
I'm feeling patriotic. 1770. John Adams saying they need saltpeter for gunpowder.
So they've got this dirt in the cave, and they somehow wash it out, and they get that saltpeter. And one of the cool things is that some of the equipment and the places where they actually did this excavation is still there from the War of 1812.
And literally has been left undisturbed for 200 years. And the wood and the tools are exactly where they were. Again, because the cave is so naturally dry, they're not wearing away.
Exactly. So Kiernan, tell us a little bit about Stephen Bishop and Stephen Bishop is this guy who really did a ton of exploration of the cave and helped us understand it in a more modern way.
Yeah, if there's one name that you hear on pretty much every tour that we experience, Stephen Bishop is that name. And Stephen Bishop was an enslaved man who was brought to Mammoth Cave by the person who at that time bought and owned the land above Mammoth Cave. He was a lawyer. His name was Franklin Gorin. Stephen was 17 years old when he arrived. And it seemed like Franklin Gorin basically decided that he was going to tell Stephen that he needed to work underground in order to make this a tourist site. And so Stephen served as a guide, but he did so much more of that than that for Mammoth Cave National Park, because the way the guides were saying it, the rangers were saying it, is that there are certain people who Mammoth Cave just seems to take hold of, and they just get absolutely obsessed with seeing every inch of it that they possibly can. And Stephen seems to have gotten that obsession. He became a distinguished tour guide and explorer of the cave. He named a number of the different places that you can visit today. Particularly, I know he named the River Styx, which is a small river area below ground, and a place that you and I visited, Ryan, called the Fat Man's Misery.
Although I think it should have been called the Tall Man's Misery, because it is so short at times. And then you and I found out that he also named another place that we didn't get to see, the Tall Man's Misery.
Exactly. I like to think that you were kind of tapping into your Stephen at that moment when you made that suggestion. And both would be fitting names. That was a very uncomfortable passage to be squeezing through, even though I'll say there were some elderly people on our tours there were people with canes in there. They were doing great in the cave. I was so impressed.
Yeah, we had some good groups, definitely.
And so Stephen, there's a lot of diaries written that recount him taking, especially wealthy individuals, because they're really the ones who were traveling and visiting the caves. And these folks, these early tourists to the cave, would have been, in suits, in big dresses with corsets and heels. And today there's some of the cave passages have stone flooring or padded down dirt flooring, which was put in, just packed down dirt, which those paths were created by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression, interestingly, and that those same floors are used today. And so Bishop was leading these people through passages that would still have had those gypsum formations all underneath their feet, and their tours were incredible. incredibly long. I mean, they would go in there for 10, 12 hours a day. So this was no small feat to be going in.
Yeah, it's interesting, to think while you're walking around, and they've done an incredible job of making the, many parts of the cave accessible and, making it passable for folks who are not cave explorers. But Stephen didn't have any of that. I mean, it was there were rocks everywhere. It was incredibly dark, and he was leading, these groups of people and became quite famous for it.
And he also became famous for being the creator of a map of Mammoth Cave that was the standard map for Mammoth Cave for about 40 years. So he, in 1842, drew a map just from his own memory of going through the cave, his own experience in the cave. And it turned out to be about 10 miles, which seems to be about as long as they had gotten at that time. And half of those had been discovered by him alone, past where they think Native Americans have gotten to. He was incredibly intrepid. He would go down, he would dig out new passageways that were full of rocks and rubble, just to open up new places where he could take his tour groups.
And he also taught himself to read and write during these tours. And he would write, you can see his name sort of throughout the caves. You see Stephen, in different handwriting, and you actually sort of see the progression of him becoming more and more confident with his writing, which is super cool.
Yeah, one of the tour guides noted for us that sometimes you saw Stephen writing his name and the letter seemed like too compacted, or he ran out of space, so he'd move it to a second line. And then as you get further in the cave, his handwriting becomes much more sophisticated, and you can see that he's getting more comfortable reading and writing. And he said that he learned to read and write from interacting with the guests and helping them burn their names up into the ceiling.
But he only knew a little Greek and a little Latin. So
that's right. That was noted in the history as well. More than either of us. The other feat that he's renowned for is there was a space in the tourist track called the Bottomless Pit, and this was basically where the tours would go up to, and then it was like, well, we can't go any further. There's a bottomless pit here, so better turn around. And on one of his visits, Stephen brought a ladder that was down below, and he stretched it across that bottomless pit. He hit land on the other side of it, and he crawled across. I mean, can you, Ryan and I saw this pit. I wouldn't be crawling across that.
No, absolutely horrifying. Yeah.
I mean, it's straight out of Indiana Jones. So really pretty amazing. And so just to kind of sum up where his life went, the lawyer who enslaved Bishop eventually sold him and the land to another owner whose last name was Krogan, and Stephen met another one of his slaves whose name was Charlotte Brown, and they got married. And actually, Bishop was freed. Stephen was freed in 1856 after that owner died. And so he was freed, and he and Charlotte were considering, they say apparently they were considering leaving the United States and going to Liberia. But there's a sense that Stephen was so taken with the cave that there was always another passage to go down, that he continued to have this tour guiding relationship, this exploring relationship for Mammoth, and he kept going further and further in. And you can see this again as he's marking his name further and further into the passageways.
And then, he and his legacy was so strong that his nephew later in life even became a guide there at Mammoth Cave. So the Bishop family, his descendants, really strong presence there.
Further on, as the tourism was picking up in this area and the caves were becoming more and more famous, I mean, again, going back to really putting Kentucky on the map, there was a period of time that they refer to as the Cave Wars. And there's another major personality here who I think Ryan and I were very true to Ryan and my heart, really made us smile. This guy named George Morrison. And so at that time, Mammoth Cave the cave itself was owned by something called the Mammoth Cave Estate. And that was quite a small parcel of land, but it had on it the main entrance into the cave system. But the truth was that this cave system was so extensive that it actually ran under a lot of other people's property around just that little estate. And so they actually resisted mapping the caves for a very long time, because when you own the land, you own everything below your land too. And they knew at the estate that once they went down that path, people would realize, I got Mammoth Cave underneath me. I could open up a tourist shop myself. I could give it a different name. I could really try to build a business for me and my family.
And that's exactly what George Morrison does. He comes to Mammoth Cave in 1915. He's looking for oil. He strikes out, but he becomes obsessed with the cave and convinced that he can lay claim to the cave by finding more of it outside the boundaries of the current owner.
And so, I mean, the lengths he went to are just amazing to think about. He hired a group of like rogue explorers to go down into the cave with him, secretly, illegally, to try to find new passageways and spaces that he could exploit as a different part of the cave system. And in fact, he even went to a retired ranger of the park and said, "Hey, you know that key for that door that goes over the main entrance down into Mammoth Cave? Could I, by any chance, convince you to push that key here into a bar of soap?" And he made an illegal key. So he would break in after hours just to get a sense of where can I get a foothold into this cave system.
Exactly. And this really annoyed the owners, and he was banned by the estate and thrown off of Mammoth Cave. And then he heard tell of this local sinkhole that, the kids would sort of play around near Mammoth Cave, and they would experience this rush of cold air. And one of the things you notice when you're descending into the cave is this rush of cold air. So George got in his mind that there might be another entrance to the cave there. And then he did something pretty wild, Kiernan. What did he do?
Well, surely he was respectful of the nature and brought in scientists. No, he got 26 sticks of dynamite, put them in the bottom of that sinkhole, hopefully told the children to leave, lit them, backed away, blew open a new entrance to Mammoth Cave. And sure enough, the cave system was below that property, which he had acquired, that the sinkhole was on. And he put up a shingle, and what did he name it? New entrance to Mammoth Cave. And now he was really threatening the Mammoth Cave estate that owned that original entrance.
Yeah, this was big business, folks. George has now opened his own Mammoth Cave entrance. He opened a hotel. This guy was a serious marketer, folks. He was a lot like P.T. Barnum. He understood how to get folks going there, and he started marketing the cave.
Yeah, and what was so interesting, it's hard to think about because they're so twisty and turny. How could he know that he actually was part of Mammoth Cave? And what's so interesting is it goes back to those signatures that were up on the ceiling. Part of his cave passage that he found from his new entrance had a few signatures on it. So he knew that very likely Stephen and some of his tourists had come down this pathway, and now he had his own way in.
And back then, when you visited Mammoth Cave, you would walk for a really long time, get to the end, turn around and walk back. So George would actually sort of hang out and snatch people up off the tours and say, "Hey, you want to see a new part of the cave that nobody's seen? Come with me. Leave this other tour behind."
And I got a warm dinner back at my hotel that you might be interested in. They said, some of these tourists said, "Yeah, I want to see new parts. I don't want to just double back the way I came."
Yeah, he started actually serving picnics in his part of the cave and, really trying to make it like an event.
And so while he was mapping his tours, again, kind of putting on that marketer frame of mind, he developed all these different descriptive names that really brought to life all the things you were seeing. Because as it happened, he got a part of the cave that had many, many more formations than the part that was at the original entrance. And so a ton of these names are still used today. And the tour that we would most recommend will take you through largely George Morrison's part of the cave. So just some of the names that bring it. bring it to life. He called certain parts the New York subway, Grand Central. He came up with frozen Niagara, the one I was mentioning. There was one space where there was this beautiful gypsum formation coming out from the ceiling that almost looked like a miniature castle, and he called that the fairy ceiling. So that's something that you might want to seek out.
Yeah, exactly. George understood that there were famous parts of the original Mammoth Cave that people loved, and he stole some of these names for himself, including things like Lover's Leap, and he had a Fat Man Squeeze. So you didn't have to go to the other Mammoth Cave because George could give you everything. And I do want to say, though, that he was really playing to New Yorkers, specifically with some of these New York names. Kiernan, I didn't see anything that looked like a New York City subway.
No, I didn't either. That one I was very suspicious of. But the ones that made sense to me was his like other marketing hook was that you can see the whole world just by visiting Mammoth Cave. And so he named one really large passage, the Grand Canyon, and another steep incline, Mount McKinley. And so you could have all the wonders of the world in George Morrison's part of the cave.
And now, of course, there are a lot of stairs that you get to walk up and down, which, make it easier. But back then, I guess folks were like on their hands and knees going up and down those things.
I definitely would have been. And they even still had this steel cable that was going through. And this is where George would say to his guests, if anybody wants to pull themselves on this little cart on this dangerous cable that goes way above the cavern floor, if you can get to the other side, your tour will be free. And he had rigged it so that it would drop 6 feet when you got on it and give everybody a little bit of a fright, and everyone would just abandon ship at that point.
Yeah, he knew how to make a buck or two.
So what was interesting, though, and this is a quite tragic story, the third person that you hear about quite a bit in the area is someone named Floyd Collins. And this is a story I know you had heard about before, Ryan.
Yeah, there's a musical about Floyd Collins. So it's a story that I was familiar with, but I didn't actually know that it was in the Mammoth Cave system. And this is it's a very sad story.
So Floyd, like a lot of different landowners, George Morrison's kind of the extreme, but a lot of different families were finding these sinkholes or cave entrances and trying to build a tourist business. Onyx Cave. One of the tour guides was very obsessed with Onyx Cave as someone who just wouldn't give in and let Mammoth Cave buy their land. And so Floyd Collins, sure enough, was trying to find a cave that had interesting formations that he could go out and bring riches to his family. And being very intrepid, he dug himself into a very tight little passageway and somehow upset some rocks and a boulder ended up trapping him underground in a space that was so tight he was completely confined. I mean, we're talking like buried in a coffin, sort of confined.
In fact, it was so tight before the collapse that he had to breathe out just to move a few inches. So he was taking a breath and he was still, and then he would breathe out and move a couple inches and do the same again. So it was already so confined that when the collapse happened, he was completely stuck.
And that the entrance to that cave you can still get to. It's called Sand Cave. And I should, by the way, say this was in 1925. And so Mammoth was known, and there was a booming tourist industry. And the fact that he was trapped, it was discovered, realized very quickly. And the locals came together to try to figure out where he was. And they were able to eventually bore down and locate him. But it took a massive amount of work in order to try to get him out. And so thousands and thousands of people were gathered by the entrance to Sand Cave as 1 week went by, a week and a half went by, and they were starting to be able to at least lower down a little bit of food to him, but they still couldn't get him out.
And this fascinated the entire nation. This was huge news in all the newspapers. They even said that when Congress was in session, they would roll out a radio, and during breaks, they would listen to news from Kentucky to hear about what was happening to Floyd. So, the nation's imagination was captured by this crisis.
But sadly, the story ends in a very dark way, which is once they actually got to where he was and they could lower down a doctor to try to retrieve him after 2 weeks stuck underground, the doctor put his hand down, touched the body and said, I think we're about 2 days too late. And sure enough, Floyd Collins had perished below ground. The silver lining is that what had been happening with the cave wars of all this competition among the different families in Mammoth Cave Estate, Floyd Collins' death really brought the community together, and they said, why are we fighting against each other when we have this natural resource we could all be benefiting from? And Mammoth Cave Estate was allowed, through a mixture of buying landowners' property and using eminent domain, to actually put together what we now know of today as the national park. I think it's 80 square miles that protect all of the cave system below, even though there are still some disconnected stray caves today that when you drive through the entrance city, which, as Ryan said before, is called Cave City, an apt name, there are still one-off caves that you can visit. But, Mammoth Cave is really the national park that brings them all together.
It's the Mammoth one. The rest are smaller.
Exactly. They are very, very good, Ryan. Thank you.
And I should note that, we're going to talk a bit about the tours that are available of Mammoth Cave, but Mammoth Cave itself is in a national park that also has hiking and lots of other activities. So it's really a place where you can see a lot of nature.
And so, Ryan, I thought we'd talk a little bit about just the practical information of visiting, because one thing that's really tough, and they give good descriptions, but there's no map that shows you all the different tours that bring you to different places in the cave. And so it's complicated to figure out, okay, do I want to do this 1 hour tour, this 2 hour tour, this 4 hour tour? And so I did a lot of research before we went, because I wanted to make sure we maximize. We had 2 days there to be underground. And so what I would recommend is, if you have 2 days and you have flexibility to be down underground for a decent amount of time, I would recommend the exact 3 that we did after my research. One is the historic tour, one is the Gothic Avenue tour, and one is the Grand Avenue tour. These take you to 3 different parts of the cave and really show you all the different geography and a lot of the history that we've been talking about. So the historic part takes you through where those early tourists would have gone, where Stephen's original exploration would have been. Gothic Avenue brings you down. They say that the geological formations remind them of Gothic architecture and, church cathedrals. And sure enough, you do get more formations on that tour. But the real humdinger, in my opinion, is the 4-hour Grand Avenue tour, which Ryan and I did. And there are 2 other tours. If you don't have 4 hours to commit to Grand Avenue, there is a subset under Grand Avenue called the Domes and Dripstone tour. And under that, there's an even further subset that's a much shorter tour called Frozen Niagara. And this is the one I would say, if you're on a road trip and you only have a couple of hours to stop at Mammoth Cave, go on either Domes and Dripstone or Frozen Niagara, because you're going to get to see some of the best formations at Mammoth.
Yeah, absolutely. So the historic tour and the Gothic Avenue tour both are about 2 hours, and the Grand Avenue tour is 4 hours. And none of these tours are hugely physically demanding. There are definitely lots of steps, and especially the Grand Avenue tour, they play up how many steps there are. I think it's like 700 steps, and you definitely do a lot. The descent is very steep, and then you kind of gradually go up throughout the tour. But there are some tours that are incredibly physically demanding. What are those like?
Yeah, so the one you're talking about, I usually only offered on weekends. It's called the Wild Cave Tour. Now, this is one that Ryan and I did not do, but if you're a more serious cave explorer and you're in good shape, you can go on the Wild Cave Tour, which is, they describe it as an extreme tour that's physically demanding, where you're going to be crawling in very tight spaces. I mean, if you have claustrophobia, you may not be comfortable in any of these spaces, because none of them don't go into some space that is somewhat tight or where you have to duck your head down. But the one you really want to avoid is Wild Cave. And you and I talked to a very excited tourist who was all set. And he was a pretty svelte guy. I think he probably did just fine on that Wild Cave tour.
Yeah, they pointed out on the Grand Avenue tour a few examples of where the Wild Cave tour was, and it was shocking how small some of those holes were they were expected to crawl through. So, that sounds exciting. It literally says on the website that if you're looking to overcome extremely challenging physical obstacles in a unique environment, this is for you. And Kiernan and I were not looking for that necessarily.
And then I did mention the lantern tours, which are very atmospheric and take you to some of those places. And so, personally, I would rather have the lights on and be able to really enjoy that movie theater lighting. As Ryan said, it's not like they have heavy industrial lighting. You still get a lot, and every tour at some point shuts the lights off so you can just see how purely black it is.
Yeah, the lights go off and all you see is the Apple Watches.
My God, those are driving me crazy. If people just put their hand over, if you have an Apple Watch, put your hand over your watch, for God's sake.
Yeah, or just turn it off for the tour. You'll be okay.
Well, don't be extreme. The other practical points that I would say is there is a lodge at Mammoth Cave. We stayed there in the historic cottages. Would really recommend that. I thought it was super atmospheric, cute. You get a couple of chairs outside. You can bring some beers, look up at the stars. A very chill place to stay, and then you're right on the property. Otherwise, there's a lot of hotels right out in Cave City.
Yeah, I thought one of the cool things about the cabins, outside of the fact there was no Wi-Fi, was, a lot of the wildlife at night. We saw a bunch of deers roaming around and wild turkeys, and it was just a very quiet, relaxed atmosphere, and truly incredible stars because, once your neighbors go to bed in one of those cabins, there's just no lights around.
No, it's true. And speaking of wildlife, where we can wrap it up is I was interested. They were talking about the bats that live in Mammoth Cave, and apparently they're no bigger than your thumb, which is very interesting. But just like at other national parks that we've talked about where you don't want to interact with wildlife, it's very dangerous to interact with the bats. And in fact, every tour guide without fail tells you if you get touched by a bat, you unfortunately have to have a very serious series of shots because they're preventative of rabies. And they also make you step through a little mat of cleanser for your shoes after you go in the cave so that that white nose syndrome that has been going around in caves doesn't leave Mammoth Cave and go to other places further on where you might travel.
I was a little skeptical of that because we all got on the bus for one of the tours and we walked their feet into the bus. So I'm like, maybe, I still think it's not 100% full.
Yeah. And then other people go on that bus. Yeah, you're right. But either way, we didn't see any bats while we were down there.
We didn't see any bats. I didn't even see any cave crickets.
I saw cave crickets. I did. Okay. Yeah. I saw one cave cricket. And apparently the further down you get into the cave, there's a whole ecosystem of blind shrimp, blind fish, little lizards that live in the areas of the cave, the lower areas of the cave where there is still water and underground rivers.
And one thing they used to offer that they no longer offer is boat tours of some of those water environments still in the cave. But because of, those creatures and it's a very sensitive environment, they no longer offer that. But it's so cool to imagine, Kiernan, like getting to be on a little boat and sort of floating down the river Styx.
Yeah, I have to say I was so sad that no longer happened. The idea of going on an underground boat sounded really cool. And I think, Ryan, we should try to get one of these explorers who are still going into the new parts of the cave to try to come on and tell us all about the technology that they're using. Yeah,
I mean, I remember on one of the tours, we actually walked by a group of folks who had hard hats on and they had maps out and they were doing that.
It was very cool. So super memorable trip. I think it's safe to say we would both recommend a visit to Mammoth Cave National Park.
Yeah, I think, and even if you have kids like, 7, 8, 9, a little over 6, I would say you could do some of these tours.
For sure. So, Ryan, thank you very much for letting me convince you to go to a national park, though you did complain about the lack of Wi-Fi down in the cave.
No Wi-Fi in the cave, folks.
All right. Well, now I think it's time for the last stop.
The last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
All right, Ryan. Well, we're here in the last stop, back above ground. The air is fresher back up here. And this is the last segment of the show. It's why it's called the last stop, the final segment of the show. It's my favorite segment. It's your favorite segment. It's popularly known as the People's segment. Now, why is that? It's because this is what I think of as the most democratic of the segments of the show because we come together as a community to share. And Ryan and I, we each bring one thing. It could be anything. It could be a recipe, an anecdote, a daydream, plans, souvenirs. It could be anything, but it must meet one criterion. It must inspire the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workaday week. So Ryan, I want to ask you, as I ask you every episode, do you have a last stop this week?
I do, Kiernan. I think one of the things we decided was because there was so much going on with Mammoth Cave that we would both make our last stops, Mammoth Cave related. And, one of the things that we've mentioned a couple times during the pod, this episode, is that Mammoth Cave is located in a little, and I mean little, town called Cave City.
Just a little place called Cave City.
And Cave City is, not a Wes Anderson movie. It's a real place. And it has a lot of, I'd say, kind of like classic Americana vibes.
Very kitschy. It felt like hasn't changed much since the 60s.
Yeah. And when you're riding in, you see a lot of signs for, caves trying to convince you, like the cave wars are still going in Cave City, trying to convince you to turn off and do Onyx Cave or these other caves. There's a little like place where they have massive dinosaur sculptures, a dinosaur sculpture park. And there is a really old, I think 1960s, 1950s-esque hotel that is just basically all teepees.
And it's called the Wigwam Hotel, which is very strange because they call them wigwams, but they are teepees. And there used to apparently be 6 of those along like a road trip route that you could take. And this is one of the 2 that still exist. And you can still book them and stay in those teepees.
Yeah, so it's, that's like a 10 to 15 minute drive. Once you hit Cave City, it's like a 10 to 15 minute drive before you get to Mammoth Cave. So, we went out there for dinner, so the night we stayed overnight at Mammoth Cave. And, I don't think we had the best experience. I don't want to say the name of the Mexican restaurant that we ate at, but there are 2 Mexican restaurants, and we ate at the one that was not El Acapulco. And El Acapulco was recommended to us. So I think if I have one of my many reasons to go back, another, I want to see these trolls that are sort of near there, but would be to check out this El Acapulco restaurant. But it's a cute little town. And I think if you had a little extra time, certainly explore one of these sort of, there was a couple haunted houses and things like that, and a lot of gift shops, but very, very uniquely Cave City. Sort of reminded me of Pigeon Forge a bit.
And there was also like a pool where Yogi Bear, there's a big Yogi Bear statue. I'm like, what kids are looking for Yogi Bear these days? Very, very fun. Absolutely.
So Cave City, interesting place. And you definitely would check that out if you were visiting Mammoth Cave. And Kiernan, did you bring a last stop?
I just want to shout out, we had some really spectacular tour guides. Sometimes the national park rangers are really make or break a tour. And we had one, Chris, who was a real veteran. I mean, he had studied the cave for many, many years, but his storytelling was still so fresh and exciting. And then we had a younger man named Tyler, and Tyler really captured our hearts because Tyler, he seemed to just really be so passionate about the geology and the history of Mammoth Cave. And what I found so interesting was, of course, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky, and we'll be talking about the Abraham Lincoln birthplace that we visited on our Louisville episode. But Abraham Lincoln is always known for having sort of a long-winded, sort of calm way of telling you a story and letting it sink in and taking some dramatic pauses to make sure you could process. And that's how Tyler was. I mean, us Northeasterners, we're so uptight. We're just talking a mile a minute. But a lot of what we learned today, a lot of what we learned and shared on the podcast today came directly from Tyler. So we just want to give a shout out and say what a great time we had.
Yeah, Tyler and Chris were awesome. And, it takes a lot of commitment to really learn about the history, to lead those tours. And I was just so impressed with, all the guides really were able to sort of answer really specific questions. Some question from kids that were less specific, like, why are there rocks?
Or how would you describe this cave? And one person said rocky.
It was.
It was right. They weren't wrong.
No, and we were below. So yeah, there's a lot.
And we did. I mean, you said all the rangers. You're being there was one ranger we had. We're not going to name the ranger. That would be gauche. But we got to see what maybe a lesser ranger is. Somebody who's maybe more interested in the theatrics. Felt like kind of a theater kid escaped from high school auditorium.
Did a few. When there's a ghost story, it kind of like loses me a bit, unless I'm on a ghost tour.
Yes, and there were some jokes that really fell flat.
Oh yeah, the marriage joke, that was rough.
It's too long to get into here, but it just didn't work. So look for Chris and Tyler, basically, I think is our main suggestion.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's a great primer to Mammoth Cave, and what are we going to talk about next episode?
Well, we've got so much to talk about. A place that we're still sitting right now, Louisville. That's what we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about the attractions, the food, little trips that you can take outside of Louisville. But, we really had quite a long trip here. So I feel like we saw so many great highlights of the city. And I have to say, I am a big, big fan. Yeah,
Louisville is super cool. So we're excited to share that with y'all. And until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
Is he taken?
Could have recorded in the cave with like an echo.
Echo. Ryan, is that a little white on your nose? Get the rabies shot.